Welcome back, students. Today's lesson is going to open a whole lot of doors for us. So far in our programs, every time we hit that run button, our program generates the exact same output. Hit run, output. Run, same output. Run, same output. The only way to get some different output would be to go into your code and change your code to get something else to show up. But now we can introduce interactivity to our programs by allowing input from the keyboard, so our user will be able to interact with the program after we've written it. Let's just get some requirements out of the way. First thing you're going to have to do is change your normal skeleton code to include this import statement, import java.util.star. And what does that even mean? Well, inside of java.util there are a whole bunch of pre-written classes, or tools in other words, that other people have written that we want to be able to use in our program as well. So by doing this import statement, we have access to a whole lot of additional elements that we can put into our programs. Just remember to include this import at the beginning of your code from now on, and you should be fine. This slide mentions some reasons why keyboard input's a good idea. I talked about that right at the beginning of this video. It allows us to make our programs interactive. Right now, all of the programs that you've written have been hard-coded, as in all of the data is coded directly into the program. We're not actually getting any data from the user. Now we're going to change that. Remember the program you wrote that told you how many calories you had eaten if you ate 4 Big Macs? Well, wouldn't it be more interesting if our program asked the user how many Big Macs they ate and then it told them how many calories? So rather than hard-coding this information like this, we can instead collect this number from the user to find out what number they want to use in the program. So the tool we're going to use to get information from the user is called a scanner. Scanner is one of the classes that's included in java.util. So by doing this import statement, we now have the opportunity to create a scanner object. So this line of code is going to be imperative. Anytime you want to get input from the keyboard, you'll have to include this line of code. It says, create a new scanner object called console, and this is just an identifier, and you can call it whatever you want, but we'll call it console or sometimes keyboard. It doesn't really matter, it just needs to be clear that we're getting information from the user. So we'll call it console, and we need to set it equal to a new scanner that reads from system in. That doesn't have to make a ton of sense to you right now, just include this line of code at the beginning of any program that gets input from the user. So what does the word console even mean? It's another word for terminal, or that window that pops up whenever you run your program. In the past, all we've done with console is see what we've printed to the screen, and that's system.out, but you'll also be able to use the console for system.in to get information that we type into that same window. After we've created console as a scanner object, we can now use a bunch of methods that are built into the scanner class. The methods we're going to talk about today are nextInt, nextDouble, next, and nextLine. Later on in this class you'll learn about nextBoolean. These examples show you how you can grab information from the user and store it into variables, much like we've done before, where we might say int hamburgers equals 3. Well, now we can say int hamburgers equals, and console.nextInt will allow the user to supply a number at that moment in the program. Notice that the method of the scanner class that we use has to match up with the type of data for the variable we're storing it into. Since hamburgers is an int, then we have to use the method call nextInt. Since tuna is a double, we're going to use the method call nextDouble. With strings, we can use next or nextLine. We'll talk about the difference in a little bit. So what's all of this going to look like whenever I put it in my code? Here's a very simple example. Everything in this is part of the skeleton code except for this portion right here. we print a message to the screen saying enter your name. Then we declare a new variable called name that's of type string, and we say it's going to be equal to what the user types into the console. Remember, nextLine is one of our options that can read strings. Then after the user has typed in their name and it's stored in name, this line of code would run correctly where it concatenates hello with their name. So now the program can greet them. This is definitely the most confusing part of today's lesson. Whenever you read doubles, integers, or booleans from the user using nextInt, nextDouble, or nextBoolean, you're required to immediately follow it up with a call to the nextLine method so that you don't cause yourself errors later on. Let me try to explain why. Let's say you ask a user to enter their age and they type in 16 and then hit enter. Well, nextInt grabs the 16 and stores that in the integer variable, but then still on your console, unprocessed, is the enter key that you hit. That's a key press and it's still sitting there on your console, unprocessed. So you need to make a call to nextLine in order to clear out that enter key. Otherwise, whenever you attempt to get information later on in your code using a nextLine, it'll encounter the enter key that you already had sitting up there, and it'll just skip over a line of code. So if you're ever wondering, hey, why isn't my program reading in this string that I'm trying to give it, it's because maybe you already had an enter key sitting on the console that needs to be cleared out of the keyboard buffer. Just kind of weird. Just get into the habit of doing it. Like here in this example, after you get a nextInt, just make another call that clears out the enter using a nextLine. So if we're trying to get text information from the user and store it into a string, we can use next or nextLine. Well, what's the difference? The next method gets the next string as in all the characters up to a space. So it only gets a single word. Think of next as getting a single word only. nextLine reads all of the characters typed into the console up until the user hits enter. So you could type in an entire phrase or an entire sentence and then hit enter, and it'll grab that entire thing and store it into the string. So here's an example. If the user types "what's up, dog," then next will grab only what's. It sees that space and knows that what's is the end of the word and stores that. Whereas with nextLine, it goes all the way up. The user typed in "what's up, dog?" ? And then hit enter. So it looks for everything up to the enter, and it'll store "what's up, dog?" in our string. So if you ever want the user to type in just a single word, you can use next. If you want the user to be able to type in multiple words, you can use nextLine. So let's think about this previous example that we had of getting keyboard input. This one is the one where they just entered their name and it read it into this variable and then printed it to the screen. So if we wrote this code and then we ran it, what's going to happen? Well, here's a video inside of your notes that shows exactly what happens whenever you run that in BlueJ. It prints enter name, and then the cursor is right here. It's waiting for the user to supply input. You type something in, hit enter, and then it moves on to the additional parts of code. So when it got to this part of the code, the nextLine part, it sat and it waited until the user supplied the necessary information. It put it in name, and then it continued running the code. What would happen if in your program you didn't include this line of code, the part that says enter your name? Then this is what it might look like. Whenever the program runs, there's a cursor. It's waiting for you to give it some input, but you don't know what you're supposed to type. So that's why it's important to include a line of code to prompt your user for what they're supposed to do. If you want the user to supply information, you have to let them know that it's their turn to do something. Prompting is an important vocabulary word. Make sure whenever you're doing a prompt that you make it clear. Saying enter a number might not be a good idea, because what if your program is set up only to read integers and you say enter a number and they type in 6.3? Now your program is going to crash. So a better prompt might be enter a whole number, or even more specifically, enter a whole number with no decimal point. Then the user knows exactly what kind of information they're supposed to be typing in. Let's take a look at this example of code. Remember, you have to declare console as a scanner object in order to get any kind of keyboard input. Then we include our prompt, just a message to the screen letting the user know what they're supposed to do. Enter your name. Then this line of code passes the ball over to the user, and it's their turn to do something. They're supposed to type something in so that it can be stored in name. As soon as they've done that and hit enter, this line of code will run, greeting them, hello, and putting their name. Notice that we have very similar code down below. You can now say enter your name again, provide another prompt, and console.nextLine. Now it's the user's turn to supply some information, and whenever we're done, we're going to store it in name. Notice that in this one I didn't put string name. That's because we already declared name as a string up here. We declared it and gave it a value in the same line. We can't declare it again, so this time it's just name. But whatever they type in this time will get stored into name, overriding the previous one. The reason I wanted you to see this example is so that you can know that you can collect information from the user as much as you want and write it into any variable that you want, even if that overwrites a previous variable. But also, you only need to declare the console one time at the beginning of your program. In this example, we go back to that concept I talked about earlier about clearing out the enter from the console and why that's important. We start off with a prompt asking the user to enter their age, and then we use nextInt to grab that information and store it into age. So whenever the user types in 16 and hits enter, the 16 is stored into age, but the enter is still sitting on the console. Now let's pretend we don't have this line of code. 16 gets processed and put into age, but the enter key is still sitting in the console, in the keyboard buffer, ready to be read. When we get down to this part, enter your name, and it sees next line, it looks to the console to see if there's anything currently sitting in the keyboard buffer that hasn't been processed yet. There is. There's the enter key that we typed after we typed 16. And so it sees that enter key and tries to store that into name, or it sees that as the end of the line and stores nothing into name. So name would be blank. But by including this line of code, console.nextLine, that processes the enter key. So even though the 16 was processed here, and the enter was processed here, basically thrown away or cleaned out. Then when we get down here, it asks you to enter your name, and it looks at the keyboard buffer in the console, and it says, all right, there's no unprocessed data. I need to wait for the user to supply something new. So after you do a nextInt, a nextDouble, or a next boolean, you're going to need to do nextLine to clear out the enter. Otherwise, you may run into this issue. Here are a few more examples, although the point should be clear to you by now. Don't worry too much about booleans. And be careful about mixing your data types. If you say some int is an integer data type, and then you try to get a double from the user, you're going to have a problem here. You can't put a double into an integer. However, you can put integers into double. Remember that you can put a 2 into a double. It just stores it as 2.0. So if you use nextInt, you can grab that integer, and it's still okay to store it in a double. So you can move one way, but you can't move the other way. Just be careful about that. So let's get started on our lab. I've got my road trip instructions loaded up with my Lab 5 project, and I have practice problems and road trip as my classes. Make sure that you add the additional elements needed to your skeleton code. So I need to do an import statement. Import java.util.star semicolon. And then down here, the first thing I'm going to do in my main method is create that scanner object called console. Scanner console equals new scanner, and it scans my system in. All right, now I can do problem 1. Problem 1 says to prompt the user, asking them to enter an integer variable, save the response in a variable called num1, and print the value entered plus 10. So I need to include my prompt first. System.out.print. Now I'm going to do a print rather than a print line because I want them to be able to type their answer to this prompt on the same line as the prompt. So what should I prompt them? Enter a number. Is that sufficient? Well, I know that I want them to enter an integer number, so how about I say enter a whole number? So that's what I'm going to print to the screen. Then I need them to be able to type a response. So in order to do that, I need to use my console object that I created and use one of its methods. Next, and what kind of information am I getting? I'm getting an integer, so I want to call the nextInt method. So console.nextInt will allow the user to type in an integer. And once we get it, we want it to be able to store somewhere. So we want that to go somewhere. Where do we want it to go? Into a new variable called num1. So I got a new variable called num1 that is of type integer that will have the value typed in by the user. Then I want to print the value entered plus 10. So let's have another message, system.out. Can do a print line this time. And let's give it a good label. 10 more than that is, and we can concatenate on some math. We need to do math now. num1 plus 10. Let's check it out and see if it works. Compile. Run it. Enter a whole number. So you could type in any whole number that you want here. Let's go with 7. 10 more than that is 17. Okay, so that worked. Notice that I put parentheses on here. What happens if I don't put those parentheses? We learned that in the concatenation lab last time. It's going to concatenate 10 more than that is with number 1. So it'll put 10 more than that is 7, and then it'll concatenate on a 10. So I think my output will change to 710. Let's test it out. 7710. Yeah, so it didn't add those two numbers. It concatenated all the three parts together. So I'm going to put this in parentheses so that the math happens instead of concatenation. Problem 2. Prompt the user asking them to enter their name. Save their response in a variable called name1. Using one print statement, print out a greeting in the form of hello name, but it'll replace name with whatever they typed in. And then an exclamation point. Okay, so I'm going to borrow some code from here because I'm lazy and I don't want to have to type everything out again. What's our prompt going to be this time? How about, what is your name? Then I create a new variable of type string called name1. And I don't want to get an integer from the console. This time I want to get their name. So I don't know if they're going to type in a first name or a full name with a space in it. So I'm going to use nextLine, so that way it'll allow them to have a space in their name if their name has a space in it. And then what do I want to say after that? Let's say hello, comma, space. Then we're going to put their name, name1, whatever they typed in to that variable. And then we want to concatenate on the exclamation point. Compile. Now I know that we're going to have a problem in our code, and I'm wondering if anyone else noticed what error we made. But let's see what this does. Enter a whole number. Okay, let's go with a different number this time, 8. All right, so there's 18. What is your name? Hello, exclamation point. Whoa, it didn't let me type in a name. It just went automatically down here. Why is that? Well, the answer is because we didn't clear out our keyboard buffer from the console after we typed that 8. We typed 8 and hit enter, and it processed the 8, but it didn't process the enter. So up here, after I do a nextInt, I should clear out the keyboard buffer on the console. So console.nextLine clears out that enter, which will allow this down here to function correctly. Compile. Let's try this again. Enter a whole number. Let's go with 4 this time. 10 more than that is 14. What is your name? Mr. McCoy. Hello, Mr. McCoy. Alright, so that time it worked. Because we cleared out the buffer, this next line down here was able to stop and wait for us to type in information. Alright, that should be enough to get you started. Good luck.
Enjoying my class? Smash that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me on TwitFace. But hey, that's just a tutorial. A computer science tutorial. Thanks for watching.